Welcome everyone to another episode of Your Desk University, bringing you live learning with AEC tech experts directly to your desk. Tonight, we're going to be learning about building secure web applications for prototyping things using Google Apps and Airtable. I'm really fascinated to see this, and I understand you don't have to be a hardcore developer to follow along. It will be tutorial style, and Jared, as you can see next to me, is hosting tonight, and he'll give you a bit of more of an intro in a few minutes. But before I get there, I just want to say again, our goal through this series has been to provide really high quality content. And we know that there's a lot of content out there for 101 classes, for Dynamo, for Grasshopper. What we're trying to provide is the next level of content. So now I'll let Jared take it away. He's been really involved in this series with pulling together speakers and helping with the website. And I thank him for being our host tonight as he introduces tonight's show. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jared.
Yep. Thanks, Timon. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of, corroborate what you just said. Like, thank you so much for everyone that's been involved so far, to the people who've been tuning in and to the people who have volunteered their time. Everyone's doing this voluntarily. So I think it's been really cool to see all these people kind of coming out and putting their own time into this. I know it's also been like pretty inspiring for me to see some of the talks. I know I spent like 2 hours this morning, I think, just like updating like doc strings in Python and just making the documentation and some of the code base that I've been working on better, which was inspired by some of the previous talks, such as the one that Ehsan and Peter Metev had given. So yeah, I think it's been really, I've gotten a lot out of it too. So thank you to everyone who's presented so far. So anyway, coming up next on Tuesday of next week, we'll hear from Courtney Dugan and Jeff Rhines from ACOM and their talk, which is titled Dynamo, Python, and Git, A Tale of 2 Weeks, where they'll talk about how they use GitLab to collaborate on updating their code base across multiple offices and how that tied into their workflow with Dynamo and Revit. And then on to today, we have Mandria and Shay, who I just want to give a quick thanks for stepping up last minute. We had to do a last minute switch earlier this week with the original speaker. So Mandrian had a really interesting topic that he is going to be presenting on today that I thought was like, I was really happy to hear that we were able to kind of get him last minute. So Mondrian he's a fellow coder and designer. He's ex WeWork design technologist and ex computational designer and researcher at Cohen Peterson Fox. His software development journey has taken him from neuroscience through spatial analytics, generative design, and more. And so today he's going to be talking about basically he'll be kind of starting off with a tutorial about how to quickly spin up a web app using commonly available tools such as Google Apps Scripts and Airtable. And then he'll run us through kind of the steps and after he runs us through that, he'll kind of show us like a quick example of how he's used this workflow in the past and something that he's built with it. So and then lastly, before I hand it over to him, please just don't forget to ask questions in the chat, in the chat below. And I'll be feeding those to Mondrian as he's going. So without further ado, I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Timon. I'm really happy that you guys invited me. I love communities that are based around teaching like this. And like Jared said, my background is in kind of design technology and kind of grew into learning a technological skill set by addressing kind of AEC problems. And today's subject is really kind of a part of that ecosystem. It's not about extending some of the CAD platforms you guys might be working with, but it is kind of along the vein of looking at things that we have and figuring out how we can build stuff off of them. So I'm looking at the chat a little bit. I don't know how many people here are familiar with Airtable. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Gsuite tools or Google Drive, but we're going to be using the two of those, and I'll try and go over exactly what Airtable is and what Google Apps Scripts is in a bit. So let me share my screen. All right. So Airtable, for those of you who have used it before and those of you who don't know what it is a spreadsheet, part database productivity tool. Its user interface looks and feels like a spreadsheet, but when you actually dig into their services and the way that you have to structure data and records, Airtables really behave like databases. And in today's example, we're really going to leverage how Airtable opens up every single base that you create in it and make that base data accessible to other applications. Google Apps Scripts, on the other hand, is the platform that Google add-ons are developed on, but also it's a platform that scripted add-ons can be developed for any Google application. You can develop app scripts that attach to Google Slides. You can develop app scripts that attach to spreadsheets. But you can really consider it kind of as a cloud-based coding platform within the Google Suite environment. And I'll talk about why that's important for securely developing web applications in a bit. So, excuse me, I learned stuff for a second. So this is an example of an Airtable. It looks a lot like a spreadsheet, but what you'll notice is that your records get kind of dragged around. Columns don't really look the way they do, and that's where the database part is coming in. Every Airtable comes out of box with a automatically generated API and documentation. If you go to airtable.com/API, you'll see a lot of bases that you have and that you have access to. And one kind of hallmark of what it means to have kind of a robust API is that if we start looking at the fields and the data that we have in our Airtable, we can start seeing how we can actually get that information back and forth from the Airtable to other records. So on the right-hand side, we have an example of what would be a curl request for that for this particular table, and we're getting our URL and our authorizations, which are all the things we need to kind of generate our own HTTP requests. And they don't have to happen through curl. They don't have to happen through Airtable's JavaScript library also, but they can happen through anything that's running JavaScript, including Google Apps Scripts. So some things that Google Apps Scripts provide is this kind of cloud IDE, and that gives us a place to start putting our code, especially our code that might be really kind of simple or just kind of these one-off functions. It's a place where you can start developing things without having to spin up a virtual environment or deal with where your code is going to be or deal with a text editor. And being in the Gsuite environment, all of this is getting protected by the same permission scopes, the same mechanisms that your Google Docs are protected by. So only people who I share this document with can see the script. And then on top of that, only people who I share this document with will be able to run these functions. And for anybody in the audience who has kind of developed web apps on web application platforms before, that is kind of a huge deal for prototyping. Permissions and authentications is notoriously difficult, even with kind of all-in-one web application development platforms like Firebase or Netlify. You can imagine just being able to get your users to authenticate and decide who your data goes to is kind of a huge deal. And especially for those of us who are working in kind of a corporate environment where intellectual property and data security are really, really important. This is kind of the first step to getting your code, your production scripts, your kind of prototypes in a safe space for your company to work. And that was a huge deal when I was doing this kind of work at WeWork, that information security could easily kill a prototype project if it was developed on the wrong platform. And it became a really big issue there as to where it was okay to develop a prototype. Did I want to go through InfoSec processes just so that I could test a function or just so that I could see if a particular database schema was going to work out well for me? And the answer is usually no. You don't want to invest that much time into just trying something out. So that's where this tutorial is going to take us. It is going to stitch together Airtable API as kind of an approximation of what would usually be a web applications database. and the kind of cloud functionality and serving power given to us in Google Apps Scripts within the Gsuite environment to kind of take care of the other proxies that we're using for web app. And altogether, you're going to get a home for not just web applications, but also low-level automations that you're doing that you need to have information from Airtable and Gsuite from. As I go into this tutorial, I'd like everyone to kind of think about how they're currently using Airtable or Gsuite, and places where this kind of automation would kind of be really useful. And you might kind of be surprised. As kind of example to get your brain flowing, this has been used in my past lives to manage training content from a Google Drive. It's also been used to kind of wrangle together Revit content libraries to figure out or to kind of keep track of how BIM content was actually getting generated by the team. And that all had to do with a Google Suite and Airtable tracking. And I'll talk more about that at the end when we go over stuff that's been built in kind of this method. Okay, so to get started with a Google App Script, you want to go to script.google.com, and we'll go ahead and just go there. And you'll see a list of all your projects, akin to how you would see a list of your docs if you went to docs.google.com, or all your slides if you went to slides.google.com. And this should immediately kind of be familiar. We're going to go ahead and create a new project, and that starts a fresh new project for us, and we'll give it a name. I'm getting a notice that my internet connection's unstable, so I apologize in advance. This will all be available online later, and I'll also be doing a write-up that will be available to you guys. So if it's hard to follow along, you'll have a chance to kind of catch up. So I don't know how many of the rest of you guys are also playing Animal Crossing. It is my rock in these dangerous times. So I am going to use a Airtable that was created to track my Animal Crossing critters. There are a lot of critters in Animal Crossing. There's a lot of metadata around them. It's fun. I could use a web app to kind of keep track of what I've caught and what I've donated. So we're going to do that together. If you don't like Animal Crossing, sorry, I don't care, but forgive me. This is where we're going. This is what we're going to do. Yes, it is. It's the game right now. It is a life simulator. And like life, it needs to be managed by tools. So we're going to build a tool for it. So I'm going to name my project my Animal Crossing Critter Tracker. And it's saving. I don't know why it's a little slow right now, but we can go ahead and continue working. So Google Apps Scripts will present you with an integrated development environment. So this is the development environment that all your coding is going to happen in. It's great in some respects because it helps you, again, it cleans up your project. You don't have to worry about how this project is going to interact with others. All your code is going to be right here in front of you. You get things like automatic testing. You have all these other kind of Google Apps Script tools kind of at your fingertips. It's not perfect though. You can kind of see that the syntax highlighting might be a little bit weird. For those of you who are like hardcore coders or use a text editor, you might be left a little disappointed. For those of you, but on the other flip side, for those of you who are just starting to code, this is a completely kosher and okay way to kind of get started. So you'll see on our left-hand side, we have a code.gs document. All Google Apps Scripts are going to have one of these. This is where your Google Scripts are going to get stored. And from there, you can actually add new files. So if I click on this guy here, excuse me, go to new, you can add new files in here. So new script files and HTML files. You cannot add anything other than script and HTML files or Google documents that you want to attach this thing to. And that can become a little bit apparent later, but that also cleans up what your Google Apps Script is going to have access to. So Google Apps Scripts is essentially JavaScript in here, but it's JavaScript that's complemented by Google Advanced Services and Google's Google's V8 runtime. So what the big difference here is that this will be really easy to see if I go to edit and go to word completion, is that if I start adding something like drive app, you'll get kind of auto completion for functions that are available within the Google app script. So the really important one that we want is something that is going to allow us to communicate with the Airtable API, which is an HTTP request. So we're actually going to use something called the URL fetch app. And we're going to use the .fetch method of that app. This tutorial assumes a little bit of JavaScript experience. I'm trying to keep the syntax readable enough that anybody could follow along. But if we go too fast, please feel free to reach out with help later, and if you want additional documentation. So this little function is exactly what we need. It's going to make a request to Airtable over the internet via URL with some parameters that we have to associate to it. So those are the two questions that we're going to need, and we're going to have to gather from Airtable. So to get started, if we look at the Airtable API documentation, we get examples of what these requests are going to look like in other languages. It's not going to be perfect towards what Google Apps Scripts needs, but it shows us what we're eventually going to need. So one thing we're going to need is our API key and our base ID. So in our introduction for our API documentation, we'll get the ID of the space. So we're going to go ahead and grab that and throw it in our app script. So we'll say let base ID equal our base ID as a string. The other thing we'll need is our API key. So we'll say let Airtable API key, or just Airtable key for short, equal something, and I'll have to go grab that. For those of you who haven't worked with APIs before, excuse me, I totally closed my window. API keys are very sensitive information. They are essentially an authentication tool for a service to know that it's you getting this. And so anyone with your API key will be able to access any Airtable you've got. So I'm going to go ahead and use my personal one here. I am going to delete this right after this tutorial so that everybody who's watching can't use it, but keep that in mind. When you're using an API key, try hard not to share it. And we're going to get to more ways to lock it down. So we're going to go ahead and go into our projects, add our API key. And then we're going to have to add this into what we call an authentication header for our web app. So in our app scripts documentation, we can find our URL fetch service, our fetch app. And here we see the method that we're going to use. So this fetch URL. If we look at their examples and also the documentation, we can find that we need to provide this kind of parameters body that's going to give us the information we need for this HTTP request to be successful. Mostly we're going to have to define a method, and we're going to have to, and because of Airtable API, we know that we have to pass an authentication header as well. And that's something that it takes some poking and prodding to kind of figure out what the proper format is, but luckily I do have that already. Let me pull up that example. All right, so this is, all right. This is the format for adding your authorization header to your URL fetch options. So you have your method for get, and we know that from our Airtable API documentation in critters table, list records. We know that we have to create a get request to the API to list all of these records. We need our API key, so I'm going to go ahead and replace this with Airtable key. And that is going to be our options body that we're going to put here. The next thing we need is to direct this towards the right URL. And the URL is a combination of our base ID and our table name. So we're going to go ahead and say let URL equals. OK, I have another question. So I'm going to go back to the Airtable API documentation. And we can kind of, excuse me, see that we have a URL here that's composed by api.airtable.com to form our target, what looks like our base ID, and then the name of the table that we're targeting. So we're going to go ahead and bring that all together. Excuse me. Again, I'm going to do a little bit of copying and pasting here. So to form the URL, to reiterate myself, every Airtable request URL will target the API. That API URL is appended with your base ID. And why is that not recognizing? OK. Good syntax highlighting at work. And then the name of your Airtable that you're targeting. So I'm looking to get data from the critters Airtable. All right, so everything's highlighted. It looks like we're good to go. Because we're in the IDE, we can go to My Function, or over here, select the function that we want to run, and go ahead and run it. So this is where the really cool stuff starts to happen. As you can see, authorization is required for this app. Google Suite is starting to consider this application as an add-on to anything. So that means that it's using my user permissions in order to just work. So you'll have, on first run, you'll have to review the permissions, choose an account that you want to use this with. Because I'm using my personal Gmail account, it's going to say this app isn't verified. This won't be a problem for you if you're working with a kind of corporate domain. But this is what happens when you might have seen this when you're kind of installing random add-ons to your Chrome or Google Suite. That means somebody else just made this, and it's not kind of an official Google thing. I hope that you trust me. I definitely trust myself because I worked with this thing. I just wrote this. So I'm going to go to Advanced and go ahead and go ahead and go and run this. So Google Apps Scripts also does a cool thing where it reads through your code and decides which permission scopes it needs to run. So
hey,
by using, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you? We're seeing just the Google Apps Script screen right now.
Oh boy. Okay. Let me get out to here. Thank you.
Yep.
Let me stop share and let me share that dialog. Cool. Do you see that window right now?
Yeah.
OK, so Google Apps Scripts knows that I'm using the URL fetch service, which requires an application to be authorized to connect to an external service by your Google user. Again, this is huge for corporate security because they can associate anything that this app does to your account, which if you're developing this app for yourself should be totally OK. What we've done in the past to kind of broaden user scopes is to use a service account to run these automations and let more users within a company use access to the script and the tools that it builds. If I started adding new services to the Google Apps Script, such as connections to Google Drive or connections to Google Calendar, you'll see those pop up as well. That this app will start requesting access to your Google Calendar, write access or read access, all based on Google permission scopes. I think that's really cool. It's really satisfying to see that. And it's also satisfying to see this because you probably use commercial products where you've seen this exact same dialog pop up. You are really using the same system, even though you're not really doing much code. So I just clicked OK. And we're going to go ahead and go back to our IDE. Sorry, I didn't know how I zoomed in there. And we're going to go and test our function again. So it's running my function. We can go to view.logs to see the process of that. But because I haven't logged anything, we're not going to see any kind of response. So the URL fetch app is going to return a HTTP response based on what it receives from Airtable. So we want to get a place to see that. So Google Apps Script's equivalent of the console logger is this function called logger.log. We'll save it, and we'll go ahead and run it. So let's go ahead and view our logs again. Kind of a word to note while I'm kind of in this pause. Google Apps Scripts has gone through a couple updates recently, and one of the biggest limitations to it was that it used an old version of JavaScript called ES5. That's no longer the case. In the new runtime, you can use ES6 here. I hope those of you who understand me kind of understand how exciting that is, because it's a real, like, it takes a big handicap away and makes your JavaScript way more concise. Sadly, a part of that also was that logs take a little bit longer to load, not necessarily that the function took longer to load, but the log itself did. We got our log and we are successful. You can immediately see our Airtable API documentation in here. You can see my arapaima fish in the river. I can get it between 4 and 9, and I can't get it now because it's not June yet. This is gold. That is the data we're looking for. And in a nutshell, that is all we're here to do. It is to get this information flowing between Google Apps Scripts and Airtable API, and that is all happening in this like 10 lines of code. Super easy, authenticated, behind walls, and ready for use.
And if you had like an Airtable base with multiple views in it, would you also in here, you would be able to specify which view you wanted to pull the data from, right?
So part of Airtable API allows you to do that. And it even allows you to append like specific fields or even use a formula to filter them. But since you're already in a JavaScript environment, what I've kind of come to do is just use this very basic high-level hit, get everything from a table, and then conduct your post-processing in the JavaScript itself. So we're going to go ahead and do that. There are a couple things going on here that I really don't like. One, my Airtable key and my base ID are right there. That makes me really nervous. Even though it's in the script and every user can see it, I really want to hide that away. So we're going to use a thing called the Google Apps Scripts property service to kind of cache these scripts into what it would be an environment variable for our app script. So we're going to go ahead and take this away. We're going to fix that right now. We're going to go to File, File, Project Properties, and go to Script Properties. And this is a place where you can add environment variables for your script. They stick with the script. There is also a thing called user properties where you can kind of associate parameters to specific users. I won't get into that yet because that's a little bit tricky. But I can add my property Airtable key here, paste in my value, save it. Now it's stored in the environment, and I don't have to use, I don't have to hard code the string here. Instead, I'll have to call the property service, properties surface, excuse me, get my script properties, and get the property that I want. And I know that that was called Airtable key. Now I'm going to do the same thing with my base ID. File, project properties. You can do this programmatically also, but it's nice to have a little bit of a UI here, just to make sure that your variables are getting through, which you might see that I just might have messed up. Yep. And we'll do the same thing. Our base ID is our property service. I get script properties. I get property base ID.
If you were sharing this Google Apps Scripts with someone, would they have access to that as well?
To the script properties,
Yeah.
if they dug into it, yes, but they would have to have access to the script document. It's a little bit different if they're using an automation or a tool that you built in here, either by hitting one of these functions using Google Apps Scripts API or using it with a web app like I'm showing you. So those are a little bit different. But yes, like that, it's not a perfect protection measure, but it's better than having it out in the open like that. Another advantage to this also is that if this project had to move, those script properties don't move with it. So we could copy all this code, paste it somewhere else, and then it would break until somebody added those environment properties to their environment, which kind of helps also. It also helps if you had to move this project around or distribute it to somebody or put it on GitHub, for example. If I publish this project on GitHub, those script properties wouldn't go with it, which would be nice, especially for now, like when I'm going to be sharing this code with all of you guys, I won't have my Airtable keys inside of there. So I've defined these variables. I'm hitting up the property service. If I run my function again, we shouldn't get an error. Airtable key before initialization. I think I did that, didn't I? Oh, I am dumb. That needs to be a string to match our property. And if we go to view on the logs, we should see that pop up in a little bit. There's a couple other things that I've learned over time with the Airtable API. There we go, cool. We're gonna need a little bit more information from our response body in order to kind of figure out like if we're actually getting the data that we want. So we're gonna throw that into a container. We also might have noticed that that response was a little bit weird shaped. That's because the URL fetch app actually returned what we know as an HTTP response and not actually a JSON object. So in order for it to work for us in JavaScript, we're actually just going to take that entire response body and parse it as a JSON, which is going to work and turn it into a JavaScript object for us. A little bit more is that our logger could be a little bit more informative. It shouldn't just dump a bunch of data in front of us. If I went to my logger and I allowed I actually counted what's inside my response, I might actually just get one thing. So let's go ahead and grab the records out of my response and count how many records my response actually gave me back. Let's run my function again. I think I'm running out of a little bit of time. So I am getting sloppy with my typing. All right, so view, logs. We shouldn't get a big kind of blob of data anymore. Instead, we should get the length, the number of record items that we've received from Airtable. We only have 100 records. If I went to my Airtable right now, I can see right away, if you are following my mouse down here, that we have 160 records. So that's something that's special to HTTP requests with Airtable. It does this thing called pagination, where it'll only give you 100 responses per request. But if that 100 responses doesn't cover your entire base or payload, it'll deliver a offset header with your payload. So that's something we're going to have to build into this function, is to sense for the offset header and rerun the fetch to kind of complete our data payload. So for the interest of time, I'm not going to type through that. I'm going to kind of do the cooking show thing and pull this out of the oven.
Yeah, and like you said, you'll be sharing. You'll be kind of like putting this all in an article and sharing it with people later, so people can go back. We'll try to post like a link to that in the video once the video gets posted.
Yeah, there's going to be a detailed write-up of this coming up soon, and you'll get a little bit. We'll be able to share that, and you'll get a little bit more in depth with why we're doing things the way we are as well. So here is the kind of response code to all of those problems that I brought up. One, we are using the property service to get our Airtable key again. In this case, I think I might have left my base ID out hanging. Actually, no, I'm passing my base ID inside the function. What you might notice, I broke out the fetch response that or the fetch function that I just made and gave it some arguments so that it's more portable. And then I wrapped that up in another function, which is handling the recursion needed to kind of sense for the offset. So we are going to initialize a response by fetch Airtable without an offset token. That's just targeting it. We're going to get our response back and dump it into a container for the records. And then if that response comes back with an offset token, we are going to run it again, this time with the offset token. And then inside of our old script, we are sensing that offset token, and then that means we have to use it so that Airtable knows we're trying to get the second batch of a request that we've made already. And in that case, all we have to do is add the offset token as a query parameter, as a query string to our URL. So these two functions are working together and then getting called recursively. So what that should do is if I create a test function, and let's say get all Airtable. Again, I'm going to need my base ID. I'm just going to copy this for the interest of time.
I think you might have a typo there in line 4.
Yep, we'll get there.
Cool. Okay.
Thank you. And we know this has to be base ID. Get all Airtable, I am going to pass it my base ID, and then I know my critter's name, or my table name. I do know my critter's names too. We'll click save, and then we just test on our function, my function. And it's done. And what's cool also about Google Apps Scripts Logger is that anything that runs will push logs up to there. So every time URL fetch runs, or our fetch script runs, it's going to log how many you got. And then when it's finished, we're actually going to count up all of them. So now I'm getting all 160 records. Yay. If you have less than 100 records, you probably don't need to go through all of that. But for scalability, I would just keep that in mind, that you're going to have to do that. If you're using another platform where you can import Airtable's library, JavaScript library, you won't have to deal with offset parameters or offset tokens. All right, so now we have a function, or we have a set of functions that is allowing us to get data anywhere within our Airtable. We can point it at any base, we can point it at any table name. Our API keys are stored in here. This is the basis for everything. From here, we could start making calendar reminders for like which critters are coming up this month, and that all, or like we're going to do, distribute a web app that shows us that. But that all starts with processing our data within here. So let's say I only want to get this data, but I want to filter this down to the critters that are available for me to catch this month. We could do that right in our IDE here and just test it there as well. So excuse me. So part of needing this, I'm going to go ahead and pull all of this, copy and paste here in the interest of time. All right, so we're doing the same thing. We're calling our base ID. Our data is getting stored in this our data variable, get all Airtable of critters. We need our month in long form because that is the form that is inside of our Airtable here. So our Saddled Beach here is available December, January, February, and March. We are filtering our data for a line item inside of our, for each record within data, we're naming it critter. we're going to look for the months available and see if it includes month now. The dot filter function, if you're new to JavaScript, it'll, like, based on the truthiness of this statement, is going to return the item within that array. So we're going to log how many critters we found. So Airtable, if a blank or a null or a false is sensed within a field, it will not retrieve that item and put it into the data. That's a good way to kind of keep your data payload small. Imagine a field with a bunch of empty items. You don't want to be passing all that unnecessary information. What that does mean, though, is that when we're concerned about having a default value for a field, we have to enforce that schema within after our request. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting my schema in this request. I know that I need caught, donated, and modeled. If it's false in Airtable, it counts as blank. Again, these are checkboxes. So I'm just going to make sure that if there is no value there, it's going to come back as false. And I'm going to do that here. So for each piece in data, we're going to match our fields against critters and fields. If you're confused by this syntax, you can ask me a question about it later. We're using a spread operator. Again, ES6 is wonderful in Google Apps scripts. But all we're doing is making sure that these fields are inside of our data body. And then we're going to return that to wherever our app is going to work. So let's go ahead and test that function again. My function, and let's go for it. Request failed. Oh boy, what did I do wrong? All right, so look in our logs. We'll see we get error not found. That means our URL got formatted wrong. So I'm going to copy that out. I think maybe let's run that again. Okay. I am not going to debug this right now. What I'm going to do instead is show you my working example. Which
Live demos.
Yeah, it should have been identical. I have no idea what happened, but let's. So what you might have noticed just then was that we actually got a pretty informative response from the Airtable API. They're pretty good about that. What you can do when you're, when you're looking at any of these kind of reference errors, you can find them in logs, but I'm going to use this to go on a little bit of a tangent. But because you're essentially running a Google Cloud project using the Google Apps Scripts API, you actually have this executions log. So every time a function fires using your script, you get a report about it. So failed, 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 completed, and it goes back to the last 7 days. So if I look into failed, you actually get the full response, the error response from whatever API or whatever function that you're working with. And because you're getting all the logs, we kind of figured that out as well. Yeah, we got all our 160 records. I don't know what happened. We'll figure it out later. Okay, so here is my the example that was in the oven. I renamed that test function into get today's critters because that's what I'm doing to this function. Again, no arguments because I know exactly where this is going. This is the point where I start separating out utility functions versus functions I'm using for a specific purpose. And this is just kind of coding organization. For those of you who are new to it, Airtable utilities, this is where I'm going to store all the functions that I'm intending to reuse everywhere. And then I have this section up here where I'm creating these functions that I intend to fire somewhere else with kind of limited arguments. These are all kind of pre-formatted. This is where my data processing is going to happen. So if I go to get today's critters, I go ahead and run it. That one worked. Great, it's not me. And I go to my logs. Come on, this runtime is killing me. But there we go, 100 records received, 60 records received in that batch, totaling 160 records. We found 89 critters that were available in May. Awesome. now we can do work with it. We've processed the data. We're going to do, I want to put those 89 critters on my calendar. I want to filter them further for which ones I haven't caught yet. That's all possible right now with the exact same kind of line of communication that you have with Airtable. So the next thing is closing the loop. How do I get data back to the Airtable? Right now, all of it is coming one way into my application, and already the kind of options are really really kind of far. For reference, when we were using this to coordinate training content, all we were doing was bringing in information from an Airtable that was kind of coordinating our instructors. Our instructors would type descriptions there. They would put metadata in an Airtable, and we would just grab all of that data and like digest it into a web app. And then our employees could look for training based on that. But it would have been way cooler if we can have our app script actually communicate back with our Airtable and actually let me, in my app, just say, I want to say that I caught this neon tetra, or I want to say I donated it or modeled it. We can do that here with create records or update records and follow the same kind of guidance that we have with the exact same format of the URL fetch request in our Google Apps script. So if we look up at our update records documentation, we know that we have to use a patch method, and we actually have to include a payload for the update. So you need to have a payload that includes the ID property of the thing that you're trying to update and any fields that have changed. So let's go to, I'm all mixed up now because I have so many app scripts. I'm going to go ahead and close these guys just so I don't get more confused. We can write a utility that takes the exact same format of our GET request and just reformat it a little bit to match what Airtable is asking for a create request. So down here, we have the example for an Airtable create a URL request, and then an Airtable update URL request. It's kind of silly that these two are actually identical because like you're going to format the payload earlier, but you get to change the match in your kind of parameters body. So for Airtable create, we're going to post. For Airtable update, we're going to patch. And for the URL fetch app, any information that we want to include in what Airtable expects as a payload, we're going to put inside this payload option in the kind of parameters body of our URL fetch request. And then we're going to take a stringified version of the payload that we're expecting to deliver. Okay, so that was in utilities, but how are we actually going to use it? So up here, I'm going to create a new function, catch critter. And the only thing that catching a critter means is that I have to point at a record ID and say, hey, I want this record ID or a record with that ID to just be listed as true. And that's it. We let our utility fire with our base ID as a property. And let's see, I think I still have this in my function up here, logger.log, donate critter, and the record ID. A really nifty trick too is if you go into your Airtable and you expand a record, you'll see those parameters up here. So that's my record ID actually for this particular record. All right, so let's go ahead and test that function. We'll go to my function, run it. And now let's look at our Airtable and see if we caught anything. Holy shit, we caught a long locust. So now we have our closed loop. We have information coming from the Airtable into our Google Apps script, and we have information going from our Google Apps script, triggering things in Airtable. Now, if I run my get Airtable command again, we're going to get this live data right up here. Those are the bones of a full-fledged web application. You're seeing data that's integrated across this platform. You're seeing actions getting conducted, and although I could do something really cool and start using Google Drive and Slide APIs to create presentations or dashboards about how many critters I've caught this month, or who knows what. I don't know if you're the type of person to manage your video games that way. I'm not, but you could. But we're here to talk about web apps. Why can Google Apps Script spin up web apps? I have 8 minutes left to do this, and I think I can do it in like 8 minutes. To spin up a web app with Google Apps Scripts, you're going to create an HTML document, any HTML document, and then all you're going to do is write a function, name it doGet, and have that doGet function return the HTML service pointing at an HTML document. What that's going to do is that is when somebody hits a URL endpoint directed at this Google Apps Script, it's going to run the doGet function. And whatever happens, the doGet function will run. You could put a bunch of data processing functions in there if you want to. You can run some batch commands or something. But what we really want it to do is say, hey, if someone hits that URL, show them an HTML document. And that is a web app. So if we go to publish and deploy as web app, you can see this has been deployed before. But if this is new, you'll just see new. You can name your change. You can dictate what this app executes as. Remember, we're talking about permissions, so we're using my individual permissions to execute this app, and who has access to it. So we could have anyone, even anonymous. I'm going to do only myself because this is pointing to a private Airtable, and I'm just going to click update. And now we have this executable URL. So now we share this URL. And this is a web app driven by that Google Apps Script. You can have a Hello World app script up in about 3 seconds with 3 lines of code. And then everything that happens after that is front-end code in the HTML document. So I know I'm running out of time, but in this case, I've quickly put together a view application that you can see it's initializing a main app. That main app is initializing with today's critters. So this google.script.run is what an HTML document is going to use to get back to your code.js. And then I've attached some methods to buttons. So a catch critter event triggers my catch critter function. A donate critter event triggers my donate critter function. It becomes really, really fast to take events and turn them into actions on your API. So anything called with google.script.run is happening on Google servers, and then anything in the HTML, your browser is doing the work. To give you a sense of reference, this happened about 30 minutes before this call. That's what I was kind of scrambling to do. So it's not polished. It's really kind of basic, but it's working. So if I click catch critter, donate critter, model critter, catch critter, donate critter. Oh my God, I have a lot of data entry to do, but this is way better than doing it in a spreadsheet. I can go to my my Airtable, and immediately all of that is happening. And the kind of data entry hurdle that I would have had if I just used my Airtable as an interface for data entry is kind of gone away, and I get something that's a lot more fun. I hope your brains are all kind of churning with what the possibilities of this are. It was definitely kind of eye-opening for me when I did use this to kind of start learning front-end frameworks, because I didn't want to go through the headaches of spinning up web application infrastructure just for the sake of learning front-end frameworks. So all of this is live already. You can share it with people. For better or worse, it will work for quite an extensible amount of time. It is based on the API limits you have with your product. So Airtable API's free limits are actually quite generous. So it's Google Apps Script, but they are there. It's very hard to kind of start hitting them, although we have coworkers that really, really did impressively. Just as a sense of reference, I think it's like 20,000 URL requests a day before you max out Google Apps Script's limits. So, and that's all that's happening here. Similar stuff like this has been used again for coordinating training. I think the last thing I was working on was using this to coordinate the progress of BIM content creation, which was really interesting. At companies, if you use outsourcers for BIM content, you might notice that the kind of logistics of coordinating whether or not which content you send to outsource and which content you is finished and which content is important for your library is kind of a headache, and you might kind of be a spreadsheet master of doing that. But like with a web app, you can actually have your employees contribute and consume that process without actually kind of polluting your organization work as well. It's a really good way to kind of get double duty out of the like intense organization that some employees already kind of institute to kind of do their work. So, I mean, just to wrap up, I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Just to wrap up, that's kind of my perspective on this workflow. We kind of created a lot of operational tools by going through the motions of creating a prototype. I'm a big fan of creating working prototypes because you get to talk around the solution with your stakeholders and your users. You get to talk about what's working in your data schema and what's not, and actually be able to institute like immediate impact just by changing a field on an Airtable. And it also makes all those concepts really accessible. But a kind of neat side effect was that we were able to kind of get, by using products that were already being used at the company or by yourself, you are doubling up on all the investment that you're putting into it. And if you're running into problems like maintaining the file structure of a drive directory, if you build a product around that file structure, the use of that product starts to reinforce the kind of data cleanliness that's going in there. So that's what happened with a kind of like our internal training content platform, was that it was really hard to kind of figure out what is the end all file structure for totally agnostic content, like training content that we had 20, 40 design techs kind of creating. And everybody handles working documents differently. But by applying a web application to that file structure, all of that became alive and dynamic, and also became immediately accessible to our users. So we had a web application that our designers had access to that was allowing them to browse our training content. Little did they know that that training content was actually just a pile of files in Google Drive. And by using that system, our pile of files was getting cleaner. So by having extended capabilities, we were actually making our productivity measures more effective. And I thought that was awesome. One more thing to note, you might have noticed that coding in Google Apps Scripts was very, very easy. It was very, very fast. It was very, very rewarding. In the past, when I've taught Google Apps Scripts, I have compared it to fast food. It's really satisfying to eat. It is addictive. It's a lot of fun. But if you have too much of it, you're going to end up working really hard to get it off. So Google Apps Scripts is not a drop-in replacement for full-on web application frameworks, although it is close. You would notice that in the IDE, I was kind of struggling a little bit with syntax. Also, we were limited in the number of files that we were able to create. And also the web app that we were creating was limited to inline HTML. I have seen Google Apps Scripts that have gotten to 15,000, 20,000 lines of code. They get really, really hard to maintain at that point when you don't have access to kind of management structures for kind of complex features.
Yeah, it's more.
That being said,
yeah,
it can be done.
Yeah, I think like you said, it's more like if you already have like a pre-existing thing, like an Airtable
You're trying to make
database, or you
superpower.
have like a bunch of files in Google Drive, and you just want to make it so that people have a nicer interface to interact with it, or like you just kind of want to maintain the structure of that schema and everything. I think that's kind of like the best use case for these kinds of things.
Yeah, totally. So this is great for like operations teams, if you're working with non-technical folks, if you're trying to just distribute something that you've made really quickly just to see if it works, or if somebody says they want a button for something and it's like, oh, I don't think you need that button, but let me show you if that button existed, how much you might not have needed it. It's a really good place to do something like that.
Yeah, I've used it in the past also for like just even like something as simple as filling out a form, rather than like having someone like go format like a PDF and something. You could just send them like a Google Forms and then kick that out to and like have that populate. So there's like very low-hanging fruit.
The workflow's been really popular for wrapping Airtable in a UI as well. Airtable has built-in forms and kind of built-in views.
Right.
But for the sake of like getting that to work with their product, there's some things that you would really wish you could do. So having a control over a UI that like communicates with an Airtable's database really allows you to do that.
Right.
So we've done things like that to kind of make custom forms, make custom reactions within forms, or even have one form distribute content to multiple Airtables. That's not something that Airtable can do right now.
Right. Awesome. Do we have any questions from any of the viewers? Have someone saying thanks for the great presentation, very informative. I would concur. I think that was really awesome to see that whole workflow kind of like from beginning to end. There's definitely a lot of potential there for people who are kind of managing large amounts of content, or you know, in a large office. I could definitely think of a lot of good uses for that kind of workflow. All right, I guess if there's nothing else, I guess we'll wrap it up. Like we had mentioned before, we'll be posting kind of like a GitHub and I guess maybe a Medium article or something that you're going to be putting together based on this workflow. So we'll post that up on the YouTube below where once it's available. And thank you so much for presenting today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Great. All right. See you guys next week. Thanks, everyone.